Hi, everyone. So I'm so excited to introduce you to our next guest, who is the fantastic Mark Robinson from the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you guys get up to?
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Sarah. I'm Mark Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the EITI, headquartered in Oslo, Norway, where we've been for the last 15 years. And we're now just coming up for 20 years of the existence of the initiative, which is a global initiative designed to combat corruption in the extractive sector, in particular in oil, gas and mining, in particular focusing on how we document resource flows coming through the sector in the form of payments from companies to governments through taxes, royalties and fees. We're present now in 56 countries around the world, which includes both Africa, Asia and Latin America, as well as a number of OECD countries in Europe and Latin America. We are increasingly focused on the energy transition and the implications that has for both managing and addressing corruption risks, but also maximizing the value of revenues coming to mineral-rich countries.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations, Mark, firstly, on how you guys have grown over the last few years. It's absolutely fantastic. And just building on, you mentioned the energy transition there. As you know, one of the main themes of this conference is all around the just transition. And what we're seeing is that just transition means something different to different people. So what does a just energy transition mean to you?
So I always go back to our core mission, which is how can we support countries to maximize the value of their natural resources for their citizens. That remains as relevant as ever as countries navigate the opportunities offered by the energy transition. But of course, some countries stand to benefit enormously, others stand to potentially lose out from the transition. We're there to support all countries, whether mineral rich or fossil fuel rich, in navigating this complex transition. And it will have big impacts on resource flows, which is why our work is all the more important at this juncture. It also has important implications, of course, in terms of how those employed in the sector are affected by those changing energy priorities. So we are looking both at the overall effects on a country's fiscal base, how they're going to benefit, how they're going to use these increased resources for just expenditures to benefit different regions, different sets of people, and how to help communities navigate a transition away from what might have been primarily employment resulting from fossil fuels, notably coal production, or other forms of mining which is not directly linked to the energy transition, to jobs which might be in sectors directly benefiting from the transition, including renewables. So that's how we understand the just transition.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. That's great to have your perspective into the mix for all of us. And so with regards to that, I mean, you've already touched on this slightly. Where does mining really come into this? Obviously, you've got it on the job side, but also being a geologist, we know that we get those fabulous minerals and metals all over the world. Is there a more specific role perhaps of mining with regards to the transparency of payments of tax, royalties, etc., in places of the world where perhaps the overarching governance isn't traditionally as strong as it might be elsewhere?
And yes, indeed, because a high proportion of critical minerals come from countries which have weaker institutions and bigger governance challenges. Not all. And it's in particular those countries that need support as, for example, ensuring if there are opportunities for countries to increase the number of licenses, to enter into new contractual arrangements, those also offer corruption risks. The huge increase in demand for critical minerals is a positive, potentially beneficial development only if managed well, and governance is core to the effective management of those opportunities. So working with countries among our members which have those sorts of weaknesses is really important. So for example, putting out in the public domain open contracts between governments and private companies, as indeed the DRC does at the moment, is really important because there has to be public oversight to know how those decisions have been taken and which companies are benefiting. The same with beneficial ownership transparency, which is a really important requirement now in the ITI standard, which has direct relevance here, making sure that companies which are receiving licenses and contracts are not run by politically exposed persons who get those by virtue of favoritism or insider deals or indeed outright corruption. So we believe we now have the tools that help us directly work with countries to assess and mitigate such risks as those. Other countries actually are rather well placed institutionally to manage resource flows. I've just come back from Chile, which has much stronger institutions, but of course it's one of the major producers of lithium and copper around the world. And they too are asking questions about how can we ensure the transparency of the sector. They're not yet an EITI member. And the purpose of my visit was to explore that possibility with the new government about how they could join and benefit and contribute to the EITI. Because the thing about the EITI is it's all about cross-learning and peer exchange, learning lessons from one context which can be relevant in another, as opposed to simply that wisdom coming from a central point down and across to others. So that principle of learning from each other, both regionally, across countries, and across the 56 national secretariats that support the EITI is a way we achieve that. We do have a strong base of work already in the mining sector, already in some of those areas of critical minerals. We're trying to include more companies as members now, which for whom some of these might be new companies, they might be renewable energy companies, for whom these supply chains are absolutely vital, to make sure that as we grow and expand into the renewable sector, that we have something to offer them too. Renewable energy companies are coming to us. As they invest at scale, they begin to face some of the same corruption risks, particularly in country environments with relatively weak institutions. So there's things we can offer even if the sector is evolving. And we're evolving essentially to ensure that we maximize the relevance of the ITI's work going forward. So using that base of work we had in the past in the mining sector and using the instruments I've just described, I believe does actually continue to demonstrate our continued relevance for that broad sector.
So do you find then that, so maybe EITI started off with kind of, very much upstream with regards to where those materials are coming from, but it's now increasingly being used as a responsible sourcing tool. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, we are. And so one of the questions for us is how much interest would there be, for example, in manufacturers of batteries or indeed of electric cars. Now, they may not be primary members and necessarily, we have a couple of such companies, members of the EITI. So we are getting much more interest in responsible sourcing questions now across the value chain. And that's what we're working through at the moment, is how far down the chain, so to speak, can we actually move with our analysis. What makes us rather unique as the EITI is our multi-stakeholder structure. The fact that we're now at scale in 56 countries with governments, companies, and civil society around the table means that one of our key attributes is informing public debate and media scrutiny. So our data also helps the general public gain much more understanding and knowledge of some of those issues. And right now, given some of the big challenges over the transition arising in part from the Russian aggression in Ukraine, worries about energy security, we do believe that that particular role we have in informing public knowledge and debate is so important.
And so with that then, Mark, I mean, I know you mentioned at the beginning that primarily you're looking at transparency with regards to the payments of tax and royalties and that area. With some of the focus now moving to things like carbon pricing and all of those areas, so different types of payments that might need to be going on, are you looking at that, or do you see that to be sort of out of scope of what your remit is at the moment?
The honest answer right now, it's out of scope. It's a very active conversation our international board is having. So the board has moved significantly over the last 2 years from this not really being a central feature of our work to now being one of our overarching strategic priorities going forward. But quite reasonably, the board also would say, well, look, what's your added value in this complex, ever-changing field of lots of specialist organizations, including those working on carbon pricing, amongst other issues, or carbon emissions? And the honest answer is right now we don't. Would we in the future? I don't yet know, because we just need to make sure we remain true to our mission and keep focused on our core parameters for delivery. And so the honest answer is right now we don't, and I'm not sure we would do in the future.
Okay, but thank you very much for answering that question. So just going back to Chile, for example, where you've just been, so they're not yet part of EITI, but I suspect in terms of if they were to become a member, what sort of difference would they see, slash perhaps myself as an investor in a Chilean company, what kind of difference might I see with regards to that?
I'm glad you mentioned investors, because investors are a group we're trying to encourage more engagement from in the EITI because of ESG. And certainly I'm one that believes that we have a great deal to offer in terms of what might be the right metrics for investors to consider as they're considering the governance elements of the ESG principles. This in Chile, this applies very directly, for example, in the allocation of licenses for new lithium production, which has not always been clear and put in the public domain. So there, for example, EITI membership would require the licenses to be put in the public domain and the contracts with them. That's a good thing in terms of the investment climate in Chile that the new government wants to create, as it attracts more investment in the sector. But for others, that may not be such a welcome thing, because in the past, opaqueness has actually benefited some parts of the sector. So it's a straight political trade-off. As the government joins, it makes a calculation about what will be the benefits. And yes, you're right, Sarah. Ultimately, if it helps investors gain confidence in the fact that these are sectors which are open and transparent and welcoming to investors, that's a good thing. The other one is about public trust. Very important in Chile at the moment, and one of the reasons you have such a fractured political system. And this government has a very clear commitment to both deepening transparency and building public trust and confidence in the mining sector, which has been badly eroded in recent years, either because there's been a lot of adverse publicity on environmental considerations or anti-mining sentiment, without enough of a sense of how does this sector benefit ordinary Chileans. So it's right at the heart of political discourse in Chile now, which is why we think it's such a good moment for the government to seriously consider joining.
Exciting stuff. So well, let's hope that that conversation continues to move in a good direction. Just going back into the array of critical materials. So I guess one of the big areas of change that's going on within mining and materials at the moment is that the diversity of materials that is being required by the technology is expanding massively at the moment. And within licenses, depending on which country you're in, you might get the license to extract, say, the copper, and in some cases you won't necessarily have the license to extract some of the byproducts or something like that, which would actually be incredibly useful, and so therefore it becomes waste, and it kicks off this whole I guess cascade of things that actually could be fixed if somebody had the license to be able to extract everything from the ground. I don't know if that's something that you see, or if you've got any comments on that.
I don't see that level of granularity. However, the fact that we have provisions to put the full details of licenses in the public domain mean it's entirely possible to put some of the information regarding, in particular, licenses and subcontracts. And the subcontracts can track those parts of the license regime that may allow then separate dispensation for those other categories of minerals or side materials that you referred to. So that much depends, frankly, on the legislative environment governing license regimes in the countries we work. And sometimes they're not under single authorities. Just to give one example, in the UK, it's split amongst 11 different authorities alone, as you know well. So part of it is information coordination, part of it is on the legislative constraints around licensing regimes, but the very fact we can make these open through the EITI actually opens up new opportunities in that regard.
Great, thank you for that. So you mentioned beneficial ownership again, and certainly I find that lots of people don't really understand what beneficial ownership really means. Now, you gave a lovely description of it earlier in terms of, well, who's actually benefiting from that particular contract, and is something, you know, is a favoritism, for example, with regards to who's receiving it. Do you have any advice, any other advice with regards to when we're trying to discuss what beneficial ownership actually is, to try and increase awareness with regards to that?
Yeah, that's good. You make a very fair point. Beneficial ownership transparency is a mouthful and it sounds terribly complicated. At its core, you're right. It's about identifying the real owners of companies and the shares that each owner has in a particular company. Under different legislative regimes around the world, the level of materiality of that interest varies. In the UK, it's quite high at 25%. In other countries, it goes right down to 5%. So that in itself is the first step, is which individuals are material and at what level. So we generally favor a lower percentage. Our interest here lies in one of the biggest investments we're making at the moment in deepening the creation of beneficial ownership registers in the extractive sector, currently in 10 countries around the world. The UK has been a leader. A few other countries have actually moved quite far with creating open registries. Many countries don't even have the legislation in place to make the information open. Particularly in Latin America, most countries, even if they're committed to building beneficial ownership registers, don't have the legislation in place to make them public. It's state information, so to speak. But half the point of this is actually to put in the public domain information about those sets of owners that are politically connected, either as officials or as serving ministers, to companies in which they have an interest. Because of course, that's where collusion stems from. It's from where favoritism can emanate around the award of licenses. So it is a vitally important tool. In Chile too, it's one of the commitments of the new government, and we were discussing with them is how and in what ways do you make this open? And some of the reasons for resistance are actually not necessarily bad ones. There's concerns about security or about the sharing of individual information, because registers do require putting into the public domain information of the names, the relatives of owners, where they live, but much of that is already known. But that often comes back to us as one of the concerns about being too public as such, but a vitally important tool in our arsenal of instruments going forward to tackle corruption risk in the sector.
Thank you for that. That's incredibly useful for all of us, I think, trying to get our heads around it. So one final question, if I may. Artisanal and small scale mining, how does that come into all of this?
Sure. And just for those interested in learning more about the program I spoke about, it's called Opening Extractives. You can easily find that on the internet, delve down into country level information. ASM is really important for us, as it should be, given the fact that something like up to 40% of world production of critical minerals comes through that very sector. But as those of us who work in the sector know, one of the challenges is trying to document the size of a sector and the significance of the workforce in the sector. The big prize is actually to create, of course, the right type of employment conditions, conditions of safety, of certainty for those huge number of people employed in the sector, which is a lot of the public focus around ASM. But there's another aspect to it, which is the lack of formalization of the sector means that it's really hard to ensure the revenues being generated from the sale of those commodities are coming back into the public coffers, in turn for development expenditures to benefit those very same communities where the artisanal sector is in place. Many countries we work in have a share of their revenues going back to local communities, particularly communities where there are extractive operations in place. So trying to track what the production is, what the employment is, what the revenues are coming from the sector is something we're really keen on doing, but the data is really hard to come by. So often we are asked this question, but we say, well, we'd have a provision for countries to report on the sector, but they just don't have the data and the evidence to be able to do so convincingly.
So I guess there is a gap in the market there. I know that we're speaking to other people who are using satellite technology, for example, to be able to try and monitor what's going on, etc. But as you say, incredibly difficult to be able to get that good quality data that's perhaps needed.
Vital sector, data scarce.
Brilliant. Okay, well, so with that, I think that's our time up, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us here today and bringing EITI into the room. So the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. There we go. So thank you very much for that, Mark, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.